Carol is founder and director and curator of the Skyscraper Museum in New York City. Her background is in architectural and urban history. She has researched, taught, and written about the history of American city building. Since establishing the museum, the Skyscraper Museum in New York in '97, Carol has mounted over 30 exhibitions on historical, contemporary topics, local and global tall buildings. The exhibition were called Giants, the Twin Towers and the 20th Century, The Rise of Wall Street, Sky High and the Logic of Luxury, The Rise of Wall Street, Super Tall and Residential Rising Lower Manhattan since 9/11. Only the titles of her exhibitions, of course, bring us to her and were the reasons to ask her to open our series. She's associate professor at urban studies at Columbia University, where she teaches the graduate program, and her program is called The Shape of Two Cities, New York and Paris. This is also interesting. Carol knows also the European city, not only the American city. She is the author of the prize-winning book Form Follows Finance. So basically with her book, she gave us the title for our series here. And the subtitle of her book is Skyscrapers and Skylines in New York and Chicago. Last but not least, Carol lives also in a high-rise with her husband in the middle of Manhattan. Welcome, Carol, and thank you for being with us on more or less high noon now in Manhattan. We are keen to hear the lecture on Form Follows Finance.
Good evening, Basel. I'm delighted to be with you tonight remotely. I'm here in the gallery of the Skyscraper Museum. I hope some of you have visited us or will be able to come to when you're here in New York. A small museum and one that's a little bit like a family business. It's hard to get away. So I had hoped to be in Basel, but instead I hope I can introduce you to the history of the New York skyscraper and to think about Form Follows Finance in a broad term and a global term, but through the example of New York. So I thought tonight that I would talk about a kind of framing issue that Christian has posed for the series, and I'm honored to have the title of my 1995 book, Form Follows Finance, to have inspired at least the title series. But I have some kind of additional ideas that I want to introduce into what I hope is the relevance to the larger topic about how capital shapes architecture. So if I begin with my slides, another title that I might have used for the lecture tonight is Highest and Best Use. What is it? And what does this mean in commercial architecture? And of course, skyscrapers are the ultimate kind of commercial architecture, the machine that makes the land pay. If I show you a view of the New York skyline in Midtown, this is actually the view that I see from my apartment on the 30th floor above Madison Square Park, a beautiful view of the Empire State Building, my favorite skyscraper. And if I show you with my cursor some of the newer buildings, the newer high-rises on the New York skyline since the early 2000s, I'm pointing to a series of residential towers here that you can see are quite tall. In the distance, another one on 42nd Street, a new office building opened just about 2 years ago, right next to Grand Central and called One Vanderbilt. So from the Empire State Building in 1931, when it's finished, to about 2020, these two office buildings are peaks on the skyline, but the new growth in New York's new skyline is largely residential. So this question of highest and best use has changing answers. over the cyclicity of the real estate and investment cycle that I want to talk about tonight. So many of you are familiar with the view from Central Park looking south to what has taken the nickname Billionaire's Row, a series of super slender, ultra-luxury condominium towers that have all been built in about within the last 10 years, and most of them just within the 5. They're rather controversial, and I'm happy to discuss them at the end of the lecture, but you can see them from the tallest one here, Central Park Towers, the very skinniest one, which is 111 West 57th Street. My cursor is pointing to. Another one, 432 Park Avenue, that we'll see as we look at the evolution of Park Avenue, and 2 Robert A.M. Stern Towers over here, near Park Avenue, 520 Park, and another one over on this side, 220 Central Park South, which is the highest achieving build out of any of these buildings at more than $3 billion. The individual per square foot price of this tower has raised the most money for any developer. It's attracted a whole series of hedge fund tycoons, and close to the top 3 floors of this building have been assembled for a purchase price of about $230 million. So if we look at this kind of pyramiding, kind of collapsed view of all of these super slenders as you can see them from Central Park, you can see their slim profiles, their slim silhouettes, looking very much like a kind of bar graph of capitalism, or a history of architecture in the way that Hugh Ferris in 1929 is the cover, the dust jacket of his great book, The Metropolis of Tomorrow, takes the history of architectural aspirations from the pyramid at Cheops in the foreground to the skyscraper in the background through a sequence of monuments that builds a kind of pyramid of history that's a very common trope in the history of architecture, and it's taken over in 1908 in this image that shows the culmination, not as the Egyptian pyramid or the all-masonry Washington monument that you see here, but the commercial tower, the skyscraper that is the Singer Building, that was the world's tallest building when it was completed in 1908. The other buildings in the foreground, as with Hugh Ferris, represent, for the most part, religious architecture, or the symbols of the state, city hall towers. So if we look at the history of architecture, we see in skyscrapers the most extreme example of architecture and capitalism. We see an impulse that is commercial, that is quite different than the investments in architecture in the past centuries, when buildings are built to represent power, but in commercial architecture, buildings are built to make money. That is, they are business plans themselves. They are ways to achieve rents. And that idea that I began with of highest and best use is what is going to drive the investment of capital in different kinds of buildings. And I want to show you that in a historical sequence that follows on the work of the Skyscraper Museum and the argument of Form Follows Finance in just a moment. But if we see here another example in the 1930s as the New York skyscraper Lower Manhattan skyline begins to take shape, it has this kind of mound or mountainous kind of bulk and presence, all centered around the capitalist magnet of Wall Street. So this idea of commercial architecture is what I'm going to explore in this next sequence. And it is the argument of Form Follows Finance, which sounds ultra reductive. It sounds simplistic. People who haven't read the book will say, oh, the argument is it's all about economics. But it's not. It's not just about economics. It's about regulation, it's about constraints, it's about cyclicity and whole range of other factors. Not all of which I will explore, but a few in this talk, and I certainly hope you'll go to the book and you'll come to the Skyscraper Museum in order to understand more fully some of these issues. Now, if we look at Park Avenue, just a few weeks ago, as I was riding my bicycle up Park, I stopped and took pictures as I proceeded north, and I thought, here's a perfect way to show how over the decades, commercial buildings take different forms and even different uses in order to realize the highest investment of the capital that is being focused on this land. So we're seeing here in this one view looking north on Park Avenue, a series of skyscrapers that were built from, well, some even in the 1920s that we'll see in a moment. But if we're looking in the foreground here with my cursor over this kind of very utilitarian speculative building that has its banded horizontal windows, or this postmodern recladding of another building that had been built in probably the 1950s, or as my cursor is looking here and pointing to the very short Lever House, the first glass curtain wall skyscraper of the post-war era, famously by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And then I just want to call your attention to the gridded white module of 432 Park Avenue, one of Billionaires Row's condominium towers. So if we look back in time at this same avenue, we're actually here, we're on the other side of the street in this historic photograph. The building that looks almost on the left, that looks almost exactly like the one that you see in my contemporary photograph, is actually on the other side of the street. And the one, like the one that was reclad, that you see in a very simple curtain wall, but with this kind of pyramiding setback that was required, as we'll see by the zoning law of 1916, you can see how the principles of form follows finance shapes these buildings, along with the zoning regulation, because these buildings look the same not because the architects had no imagination, but because the zoning law designed them. And I'm going to elaborate on that in slides later. But if we proceed up Park Avenue, we can see as we're moving north, in the foreground, we're seeing some of the 1920s apartment buildings that have been allowed to rise taller than the cornice lines that we see farther north along the avenue. If we look at the white tower that's coming just out of the back, it looks like the same building, but it's another building. That is the Robert A.M. Stern new condominium tower. That is another one of the Billionaires Row. So if we take the same section of Park Avenue and look back at it historically, you can see what these taller buildings have replaced. They are replacing the flat cornice line of a series of almost identical, slightly different roof heights, but almost identical, somewhat classical buildings that are all posh apartments that have been built lining Park Avenue, which of course has a roadbed that goes over the railroad tracks that are coming into Grand Central Terminal. So this whole trajectory, the straight line avenues, which is characteristic of New York's grid, is here a covering and a real estate development that allowed for the railroad cut of all the Grand Central, the trains from various railroads, but especially Grand Central, coming into the terminal, and is built over in order to create high-end property out of basically industrial land. So taking that typical form back a little farther through time, you can see that Park Avenue previously had more gracious park space and more reduced lanes for cars, but the privileging of the car is certainly something in the late 30s and especially in the post-war period that New York suffers from. But here you see a more neighborhood-like Park Avenue with the church in the foreground and the posh apartments and penthouses on the upper floors. And that is still the character of Park Avenue in the northern end. That is above 60th Street or so. These buildings are high-end residential, but they're capped, and their highest and best use is constrained from being office space and taller space by a building code, which is the tenement house law. These are not working class tenements, but they are nevertheless height capped in New York by being housing. There's a change in the law I won't go into after 1929 that allows for the taller residential towers. But in any case, the point that I want to make is made by this map of 1914 and then 1923, about a decade later, that shows, done by the Regional Plan of New York and its environs, prepared by them and recording the property values or the land exchanges of the price of land per square foot in New York, with the black being the highest prices, the red the next down, and moving down from green to yellow. And as you can see with my cursor, Fifth Avenue lines the park, and then there's Madison and Park, so Park Avenue coming into 42nd Street, where Grand Central determines the highest and best use because it's the nexus for transportation, for commuters, and for business, and creates a new skyscraper district around the axis of 42nd Street. But you can see that the farther you go north, as in our photograph, on Park Avenue, that the values become less. So there's always a correlation between high land values and high-rise buildings. But there is also a constraint on what the maximum use can be. And that's what I hope to show you a little bit more through a series of slides and explanations that I think help to complicate this kind of simple equation. So at the base of commercial architecture is demand for space and location, and speculation, the hope, the optimism that demand is going to be so great that the future building that you're going to put on that site is going to make a killing, make a huge profit. But always tempered, and this is really the history of the skyscraper in New York and many places, always tempered by regulation. So one of the regulations in New York, really the first, is zoning, which is instituted from a completely laissez-faire situation of growth in 1916 and puts a constraint on the shape of buildings. And you see in the center of this sketch by Hugh Ferris, again, a setback building that steps up like a series of smaller boxes with a tower that can rise to unlimited height over a quarter of the site. On either side of flanking that 1916 to 1961 bulk and massing are two alternatives that determined the maximum amount of development allowed on a site in New York after 1961, when a new zoning law tamped down on the amount of space that you could put on any on your lot, depending on the size of your lot. So that tower form that you see here on my left-hand side with an open plaza around it, which allowed the space to be squeezed into a square, rectangular, prismatic tower, versus the one on the right-hand side, which has the same amount of floor space but configured in a different way. This open space is something that applies to, later as we'll see, the super slender towers of Billionaires Row. The floor area ratio, the amount of floor space, which is constrained by the 1961 zoning law, changes the formula of Form Follows Finance. Another way of illustrating that same idea is to see the same amount of floor space but contracted into the site, so turned into a smaller footprint with multiple floors. So you see two alternatives here. We're going to come back to these ideas, but I want to illustrate them more in the more historical kind of retreat into the early history of the high-rise that we'll see that I lay out in Form Follows Finance. So we'll pass by this slide and the cover of the book again to kind of recapitulate in brief the argument of Form Follows Finance, which you see has the subtitle, Skyscrapers and Skylines in New York and Chicago. So I asked the question in this book, why, if the individual office is the same in New York and Chicago, as it is, a single office or a full floor plan, it follows the same rules of necessity, of practicality and utility in New York and Chicago. But in the two cities, the skyscraper takes a completely different form. And so the book asks the question why, and it finds various reasons. The first and most important reason is the platting of the land. And you can see in Chicago, in the loop in the center of the business section that you see in the mapping on the right, in the big open prairie of Chicago, a city that was only began its kind of pioneer evolution towards urbanism in the 1830s. You see the platting of the land of these big square blocks. They're separated by, the streets are very separated, they're wide, and the blocks are big and square. In New York, by contrast, where the skyscraper takes root in the colonial city and begins to transform it, you see on the left-hand side, Lower Manhattan, focused on Wall Street in an area where the financial district begins to take over the architectural character and architectural uses of the business center. And we're going to look in closer detail. I'm not sure that you'll be able to see that clearly on your screen, but if my cursor is pointing here to two spots that are the highest land value in not only in New York City, but in the world. In 1903, this is a map of urban land values, kind of subject that was created by the urban land economist Richard Hurd. And he made a map of Chicago and one of New York that recorded the sale price for properties, so exchanges sales of land. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the highest land value in New York per square foot is right here at the corner of Wall Street and Broad and Nassau Street, right next to the New York Stock Exchange, across the street from the U.S. Treasury, at the corner of what was called literally the corner, which was the 23 Wall Street, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan, the most successful banking house in, I guess, the world at that point, the consolidator of great corporations. So this concentration, this kind of magnetic concentration of capital at the center of the financial district, you can see reflected in the $400 a square foot land price on Broadway, which is the other kind of corridor of value, $350 a square foot, $250, $200, until you go up to City Hall Park. There's somewhat lesser value there, but again, $200 right next to the political center of power, which is also the newspapers row. So perhaps these large numbers are surprising, but much more surprising are the numbers that are just 2 blocks away in any direction you want to go, but the direction is towards the water, where, as you can see, on the working waterfront, the value of the land is, let's see, $20 a square foot, whoops, $20 a square foot, $10 a square foot, $8. On the other side, East Riverside, $7, $10 a square foot. So 1/40th of the value of the land just a few blocks away. This gives lie to the simple explanation that New York is an island, so the buildings had to go up instead of going out. You can see that there was plenty of room for them to go out, it's just nobody wanted to be there. They weren't willing to pay, to bid up the price of land at the edge. So land values, and of course in New York and in the United States, we own land fee simple. We are able to develop it to its highest and best use with some constraints of zoning. And you can see the lack of constraint in the development of commercial architecture in the financial district. We're looking here at Trinity Church spire, so we're looking up Broadway towards the Singer Building, world's tallest building. This view is about, probably about 1916, because this, the Equitable Building, I'll show you again further in a moment, but this is not the tallest building, but is the largest building in the world at the time, 1.2 million square feet. Sorry about this, the feet, but it takes too long to translate in my head. So we're seeing a building that is massive and bulky and throws into shadow, as we'll see all the older surrounding buildings. This and Wall Street then goes off here to diagonally to the right. By contrast, so looking at Chicago and New York in contrasting examples at the same moment in history, we're seeing a city in this Randall view, a city that you saw before, big square blocks, and by the nature of those large blocks, and by the fact that Chicago had a height limit when New York had none, from 1893, Chicago instituted a cap on heights that was changed a little bit. It started at 120 feet. It went up a little bit and down a little bit, but it remained as a flat cap until 1923, when skyscrapers of a more New York variety begin to appear on the Chicago skyline. So Chicago's commercial architecture are big square blocks that are capped in height, and as you can see from any number of examples here, if my cursor shows them, they must be, because of their size, they must be penetrated at their center by a light cord. Because in this era, as we're going to see in some additional slides, in this era, daylight illuminated the workspace, and windows were the way that they were ventilated, and this controls the depth of the floor plan. So all of these things together in this basic binary of New York versus Chicago shows you how Chicago buildings are going to look the same in an individual office, but they're going to look different in the skyline. They look like each other in Chicago. New York buildings are much more heterogeneous because the lot sizes are quite different. Until the 1920s, when they all tend to look the same because of zoning. So Chicago buildings look the same. They're of a type, this classical box, a kind of palazzo-like form. And in the skyline, as you can see in this postcard from the early teens, you can see them by contrast with the city of New York at the same time, which is a city of towers, a city with small lots, with development that was unconstrained, so it pushed up in places where there was a high value, a high demand for space, and a speculative drive in order to create more real estate at those locations. So if we look at then New York as our model, New York, the capital of capitalism from the early 20th century, the skyscraper is this most extreme example of how the investment in architecture, in built forms, in the built environment, is a business plan for making money on its own. And we see the enormous boom in growth and investment in buildings in this contrast of the skyline in 1902 above and 1921 below, so that if I show you the Woolworth Building, world's tallest building in 1913, and above that, at the turn of the century, the World Building, which was the tallest in the city in 1890, but by 1899, the Park Row Building, you see right here, was the tallest office building in the world. And we go down here in order to see the Park Row Building, barely half the height of the Woolworth Building. So you can see how within even a decade's worth of time, there's an immense amount of investment and also technological advances that allow for these taller buildings to exploit the value of the land. And that's what I'm going to show you here in a series of slides that show a project that you can see on the Skyscraper Museum's website. It's an interactive map. It's a lot of fun to play with, to explore. And on our website, under the 10 and taller feature, you can see, as you see here, the footprints of 272 buildings, or 252 buildings that were 10 stories or taller, from the very first one, first two actually, in 1874 to 1900, when steel cage construction or steel skeletons become so ubiquitous and understood that that tall buildings become much more common. So 1900 was the end date of this exploration, and on our website you can zoom in on the individual buildings. You can also take a timeline and add the footprints every year to see which buildings are built when and how they advance up the island. But the thing I want to call your attention to in this map is, of course, Lower Manhattan with the land values, the extreme land values that you saw in 1903, is this cluster of all red, which means all office buildings. The corridor of value is this trajectory up Broadway that from Union Square and Madison Square Park begins to go up through the west side. And you can see this is largely red and orange. I'll explain in a moment. But that once you get above 34th Street and to Central Park here's Billionaire's Row of today, you see that all these buildings have blue footprints. And that means they're residential architecture. So simultaneously, in the first quarter of the history of the skyscraper, the last quarter of the 19th century, office buildings and residential buildings were tall buildings being developed for sale as space for rent or for apartments for rent. And so we look on the website, and you can explore further the individual buildings by each one of these little bar graphs representing the height of the building, but also its use. So the red is office buildings, the blue is residential, being either apartments or hotels, and the orange that you see at the end, beginning after about 1893, are loft buildings. Loft buildings being basically just space for rent for either light manufacturing or publication or especially in New York, the garment industry. So for places for production. So not as appointed as office space, not as expensive as office space, but as you can see, increasingly ubiquitous as a form of real estate development in New York to answer the demand for space. And so if we take this timeline and we look at it the way the history of architecture usually looks at the history of the skyscraper, a series of tall buildings, tall and tallest buildings. Skyscraper Museum is much more prone to ask the question, what is it that characterizes not the tall, but the all? The buildings under this 200-foot datum, where the vast majority of the space of urban development is being constructed. So I invite you to look at that project at your leisure. We look again at the Singer Building, so in this trajectory or the kind of evolution of height or the ascent of the commercial building. This is the trope that is most engaging in the history of architecture to many people. So we look at the tallest building in the world in 1913, as I said, the Woolworth Building. But let's look at its plan for a moment. And we see what I was talking about before in terms of the light entering the office space. We see a U-shaped plan so that there can be a light cord at the end. And I'm showing you this one in order to contrast it to the Equitable Building that we've already seen, in order to see how this giant footprint of the Equitable Building has a perimeter of space that goes around and is continuous in its depth of no more than 28 feet, in order to use the light around it to illuminate the space. So I can see I'm already getting behind myself, and so as not to speed too much through this material, let me pass by these other views of the Equitable Building that you've seen before, the concentration with it at the center, the way that it stole its light from the older, shorter surrounding buildings that would have been in its shadow once the noonday sun came, was above. And it's that problem of light that means that the Equitable Building is the last of these egregious mammoth buildings to be allowed in 1915 when the forces that had previously been called for constraints on building finally passed a law that had been in the works for about 20 years that was the 1916 zoning law. And the principle of the law was to keep this V shape of sunlight penetrating onto the streets, which meant that the buildings needed to step back within that V of light. So that we see them in these diagrams or in the massing studies by Hugh Ferris that shows you how a big lot would be more profitable because the tower over a quarter of the site to unlimited height could be exploited in proportions that made sense. This wireframe indication of the same issues of massing study is far less inspirational than the Ferris drawings, and Ferris did kind of capture the imagination of architects, and I argue in other places, moves them towards a kind of recognition of the simple massing as a modernist feature. But you can see in these illustrations, what I'm showing you is not modern architecture, it's architecture which is determined in this form follows finance formula, constrained by zoning, as well as by the limits of technology, of incandescent light versus other fluorescent lights, which will come in later. And we've seen before how this plays out as the shape of the skyline. So if we look very, very briefly at my favorite building, the Empire State Building, we see it from the air here in the same kind of view that is illustrated in this diagram that is a way of showing you the different heights and the different paybacks for a different number of stories of building. And the briefest way to describe this is in the cover of the book that this is one plate from, called The Skyscraper, A Study of Its Economic Height. The economic height of a building is the one that will return the most money for the dollars invested in its construction, in its land, in all of the parts of the business plan and the project. Taller buildings create more space, but they're also more expensive to build. And so if we take what I would call the blueprint of the Empire State Building, what I do in Form Follows Finance, illustrate as this blueprint of the Empire State Building, it's a letter that tabulates two sets of columns. One is the cost of a 55-story building, the amount of space it will create, and how much the anticipated rents will produce against the cost of the building. The other one is for an 80-story building. And the formula and the difference between those two will determine whether the building is 55 stories or 80 stories. Empire State Building became 86 stories in order to secure the title of world's tallest, because that has status as well, and that has value. But this idea of the economic height of the building, you can see in this early drawing that was published of the Empire State Building, with what the museum put next to it, a series of its floor plans piled one on top of the other. I won't talk about the plans so much, but you can see that the Empire State Building does not have its iconic mooring mast, its stainless steel kind of signature top. Here it's just a plain flat-topped building, 80 stories, that is meant to produce the highest rents. The floor plan, like the one that you saw with the Equitable Building, is a regular perimeter of space. This was one of the 4 points, design points of the program of the Empire State Building, as William Lamb described it, the architect. And the space of the workspace illuminated here, as you can see, by small incandescent lights, because that was the only thing that technology allowed at the time, but principally illuminated by the windows, where the workers sit close to the windows, which of course open and close for ventilation, because air conditioning has not been invented yet in 1930, or it's very primitive at this point. That changes in the post-war era. It changes with and the zoning law changes, as we've already seen. It changes aesthetically, too, with examples like the Seagram Building, which from 1956 or 58 is a model, a paradigm for modernist architecture around the world, but especially in New York and Chicago, this international style is triumphant. It's embraced by the corporate world. In this case, the aesthetic of the prismatic, simple, rectangular, minimalist tower, the less is more of the materials of steel and glass, is set back in a plaza, a kind of acropolis that Mies valued and that modernism valued, but that became embraced and then institutionalized in the zoning law that I've already described to you. So that floor area ratio, which set a maximum amount of space, incentivized open space at street level, was written into the zoning law and produced in New York a solution for the office building, the kind of big box office building, like on 6th Avenue here, Avenue of the Americas, where that simple minimalist tower is set back from the street in order to open up the space of the city for more sunlight, which was much prized, and public spaces in the front yard, in effect, of these buildings. This changed the character of New York, both downtown, but especially in Midtown. And it changes, too, in a continuing way, now with my conclusion, and I know I'm going a little late, but if we return to the changing uses that we've already seen existed in the early, the late 19th century and through the early 20th century, in these residential buildings that follow the same zoning constraints that had been instituted in order to protect sunlight on the streets and to constrain the amount of overbuilt space after the zoning law change of 1961, where the FAR, the floor area ratio, is constrained. But in addition, this is a whole another lecture, but in addition, you can purchase the air rights of unused FAR from adjacent properties and pile them on top of your building. So these super slender towers of Billionaires Row that we're seeing here across 58th Street, you can see as a type that evolves in New York. These are all examples. They're unified by their slenderness ratio, the base to the height. All of these buildings use the development strategy of slenderness in order to take their limited FAR and to move it up as high as possible in the sky, so that the squeezed floor plates, the small floor plates, then can pancake all of these floors and consume only 300,000 square feet or 500,000 square feet, but put the eyeballs as high up into the air where the value of the land of the space is the greatest. And you can see the difference between tall and big in contrasting what some people call in New York super talls, but the buildings behind the super slender, skinny towers of New York are to the same scale the real super talls of the world. They are the Burj Khalifa, also a residential building, moving from the right to the left, the Shanghai Tower, the Mecca Clock Tower in Seoul, the Lotte World Tower, an office building and mixed use. These are the super talls globally. The slender buildings are absolutely constrained in what they can place on a given lot, which is in the tradition of New York zoning regulations. So we explore this at length and in lectures and on our website in an exhibition called Sky High and the Logic of Luxury. Explains a kind of form follows finance interpretation of these luxury residential buildings. So, in conclusion, demand and speculation is what drives commercial architecture, whether it's office buildings in New York or in Chicago. And I throw this in at the very end because as a kind of segue to perhaps your questions and answers about what is the role of capital, of banks and of larger financial institutions in driving speculation or enabling speculation. The wonderful play, so illuminating, at least to me, of the kind of evolution of capitalism, but within a family, the Lehman Brothers family that came as immigrants, German immigrants to New Orleans, became cotton brokers, became bankers, became international investment bankers, is a model that shows how capitalism moves from real space to a commodity, to tradable futures, in a way that dematerializes the building. And the wonderful set for this modernist tower to frame this explanation about capital and about commercial architecture applies equally to commercial banking. So I guess I invite your thoughts and your questions about these broader issues of capital, how they maybe don't transfer as lessons from the commercial environment of New York, capital of capitalism, to a more constrained land use policy or planned urbanism that one finds throughout Europe, but less so perhaps in other places, China, Asia, and the rest. But this highest and best use is no longer a question, it seems to me. It's a statement. It's a statement that applies to commercial architecture and that realizes that commercial architecture is a business plan in itself, that buildings are built to make money, to produce money over time, and their use, which serves us on a whole different range of questions we ask of architecture and answers that we give about how to live, are indeed embedded in this system of capital that Christian has called our attention to. So thank you for your attention tonight, and I'm very happy to live come back and answer your questions.
So let's try this. Thank you very much, Carol. Of course, I'm very impressed by these facts, and of course, in Europe we are a little bit more moderate and a little bit more away from the economic-driven architecture, but also we face the fact that most of our apartments are owned by pension funds, that we have very long mortgages, our houses belong to the banks and not to us, even though we say we own a house, but my house is maybe 80% belonging to the bank, and also we don't have to pay the mortgage off like in other countries, so this is a little bit special here in Switzerland. But I want to start with a first questions, and this would be, of course, we see that you personally think, and you also proved that Manhattan's skyscrapers and Chicago's high buildings are driven by the finance industry, developers, investors, and how and where in that exactly do you think money plays also a major role? Or in other words, how much does it go into aesthetics? Was that also a point, for example, how much steel an architect used per square meter or so? How much was it really driven into this economic cycle, and were there also architects that did other things that let themselves do high buildings a little bit out of the economic cycle?
Well, I think that the complications of the simplicity of form follows finance have other factors that I didn't have time to discuss in the talk, but which are very real and which are marginal, one of which is aesthetics, whether one calls it ornament or materiality, the quality of materials. One thinks of Mies van der Rohe in the Seagram building. There's an extra element of expense, but there is a payback in terms of status. Likewise, location has status. Design value of, today we call it branding, that has status. So I think there are these additional factors that are incremental value propositions or variables in the equation of the formula the formula for profit. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about the ultra luxury condominium towers, the residential architecture, and their profitability is that in an exhibition that I mentioned, the Sky High and the Logic of Luxury, that looked at these super slender towers, the subtitle, The Logic of Luxury, was an explanation about how if one spends extra money, one can reap higher profits. So the element of luxury gets baked into the equation in some places in an opposite way that one thinks usually of value engineering or function or extreme utilitarian functionalism, where the lowest price, the cheapest solution is what you kind of devolve to. So I think there are many ways that additional variables come into the side from each side of the formula for form follows finance.
So maybe for the Basel people, could you tell us what such an apartment can cost? We probably have no idea, and they will knock us down, especially if the people are not even living there. But what would such apartment cost these days?
I can tell you that, but I will reserve, that punchline for after the basic predicate about values of private real estate in New York City. So a small one-bedroom apartment in New York is $1 million, right? So the penthouse apartments in any one of the billionaires' row will range from the lower floors, maybe in the smallest apartments, $3 or $4 million, to, let's say, $30 million, $50 million. And there is one, the one that I mentioned, 220 Central Park West, the Robert A.M. Stern design by a very large developer in New York, Stephen Roth of Vornado. They have sold the top 3 floors of that building for a total of $220 million. So phenomenal prices. $100 million is the aspirational price that the developer really wants to get. But if your colleagues would like to go to look at the exhibition, The Logic of Luxury, which we did more than 5 years ago, there we quantify the per square foot cost, which is the other key way to understand the formula. Per square foot is how New York values these properties. So it's unclear how much these buildings cost to build, but let's say maybe $1,500 a square foot for the construction costs. But the sale price is at least $5,000 a square foot and up to $10,000 a square foot. So there's a great deal of room for profit in a successful project.
Das ist etwa 50 to 100,000 Franken per square meter. I just tried to transfer it easily into dollar per square meter. Are there any questions? Can also ask it in German and I translate.
Is there still no limitation on the height of a skyscraper nowadays?
Yes, the question is if there is still a height limitation these days, or can you briefly explain how this works, that you can get so tall and with these air rights, because this we don't have either.
Right. Well, this is a whole nother hour lecture, so maybe another time I can really explain it properly. But in brief, the principle that I tried to explain of the zoning law that exists in New York from 1961 through today limits the floor area, not the height. There is no cap on height in New York other than a sky plane. If you can't go above the angle of the sky plane, but that allows you to go very, very tall. But the floor area, the physical amount of floor space piled one on top of the other, can go to unlimited height. But the floor area is radically constrained in New York. You can purchase unused, undeveloped air rights only from adjacent properties, so only contiguous sites. But those air rights can be purchased and then piled on the top of the building. So a tiny little, like a balloon, the more you squeeze the balloon in, the long skinny balloon, and the taller it gets in relation is the same amount of floor space as a short, fat building. So that's how the formula of FAR plus purchased air rights allow you to go to unlimited height.
Just very brief, I explain it. Es ist wie bei uns eine Bebauungs- und Nutzungsziffern. Und what they also do then, they don't put apartments in all floors. They have some voids, also only apartment, and then they can go higher, for example. Or they can have some mechanical floor that don't count. And the air rights, das sind Rechte, wo man kaufen kann, Sichtrechte in anderen Parzellen, kann man von den umliegenden Parzellen bauen. And what was very interesting to me, that I think it was at 57 or 56th Street, that one of the towers, the ultra-thin towers, was built completely into another building. So it had not even a direct access to the street. It was planted into an existing building. I don't recall which one, if it's the Vignoli or what, but so there are all kinds of tricks, and of course, if you have a very slender building, the shadow cast is not so high, and you have seen that the angle of the light is much steeper in New York. It's maybe, what is it? Was ist das irgendwie 30 or 80 degrees or 60 degrees, and we have this 45, but they have a very steep angle, so they can go much higher. Other questions? Auch in Deutsch kann man etwas fragen. Now, when I walked through the Wall Street district, I saw that some of the Wall Street buildings were already rented out or refurnished as apartment buildings. The question is, what happens if the office more or less disappears in the future? If office goes more digital, the financial industry goes digital. I heard that these financial people are now living in Florida, and they do this from the computer. They don't need to be in a very expensive tower at Wall Street anymore. What happens if the office disappears to the skyscraper in a financial city like New York, London, or Shanghai or whatever? What do you think?
Well, this is a question that many people have been asking because of COVID. As a historian, I like to take the long view, and what is completely clear about not just the history of New York, but the history of cities, is that cities have so many multiplying variables of efficiency, of human interaction and decisions, which are separate from the immediacy of the workplace or the change of the markets. I think actually, so I have no fear that that we are in for a radical shift of the urban economy, or the way that people work. I don't think it'll last much longer than probably 3 or 4 years till we're back at probably a 4-day work week. But you know, who am I to project those things? What, as a historian, I would call attention to is New York after 9/11, and especially Lower Manhattan after 9/11, because for a decade. So for the first 10 years of the 21st century, and we're only in the second 10 years of that century now, or a little more than that, downtown was a catastrophic site, right? It had a void of 16 acres, so 8-10 hectares, a void, unpassable, horrific in its in the site of it. It took 10 years to gain a ground plane back at ground zero, and yet, despite that incredible setback to the economy, to the built environment, to the urban urban amenities of living in Lower Manhattan, the population doubled in Lower Manhattan. So there was, in part, a positive transformation of the neighborhoods of downtown, so that more people lived downtown. There were apartments that were adaptively reused from older office buildings into new residential space. So that's what I expect will happen in New York, in a place like Midtown. Downtown is already transformed into more of a neighborhood. It is not completely dependent on the financial district, because the banks moved to offshore, around the world in the 1990s, not in the 2000s and 20s. So those changes have already happened in terms of the shifting economy, the commodification of real estate, so that the ownership of portfolios where buildings are simply profit sheets rather than an owned and operated enterprise where a developer is then paid rents for the office space or for the apartment. So all of these things happen in the larger economies. And I think that the trajectory that you have identified in the framing of this series is something which is very real. And the difference between New York and Europe as land ownership and markets and government policies make different situations. But the logic of capital does have this kind of abstraction that you're talking about, and the richer people profit from that system is absolutely true. But at the same time, and I think what my lecture tried to illustrate is that demand and speculation are these entrepreneurial engines of enterprise and urban economies. that will change cities somewhat through time, but will leave them essentially our best hope for civilization, really. I'm a great urban advocate, as you can tell.
Great. Thank you.
How
Yeah.
have life cycles changed during the change of economic interests?
The life cycle change of a building in terms of expectation of a return on investment?
Standzeit einfach, also bis,
No.
bis sie abgerissen werden und
Ah.
neu gebaut.
Oder auch intern remodeled, oder? Yeah, I mean, basically you ask, sorry, yeah, sorry. You ask basically what is the lifespan of a high-rise? Generally, were high buildings already demolished because the land value went up, and also the interior and so on? What is the lifespan of such a high-rise?
So there are many different answers. The Empire State Building will soon, well, in 10 years, it's 90 years old now, right? It'll be 100 years old. The Woolworth Building is 120 years old, and it still functions as both an office building and now converted to residential in the tower section. So depending on the quality of the building or its easy adaptability as a new use of space. There's no, as in Germany, you reclad buildings all of the time. I know Frankfurt has modern buildings built in the 1960s that have had 2 or 3 different facades updated. And New York is doing that now too, but the more important lesson, I hope, of my lecture is that growth is constrained by regulation in New York. You can't keep tearing down and building up a bigger building. Taller, yes, but no more floor space than existed before. And the continuous, over 100 years, the continuous progress of planning New York has been to take away a city of no controls to a city of some kind of control and then a greater control on top of that. And now what one sees is much more a kind of community-based bottom-up planning voice that has entered the conversation. And so that is very much of a balancing or a mitigating factor against these forces of capital that we have been discussing.
Okay. Thank you. Is there another question? So in that case, I want to close and go over to a small apéro, which unfortunately you can't be part of, but I hope by the end of the year that you can make it to Basel. Thank you very much, Carol, for this great lecture, the personal reception at the museum, and giving us the right to use the title. Thank you for opening and giving us lots of thoughts for our series. Thanks, Max, for the repeated collaboration and for the technique, the complex technique. Claudia, also thanks for being a part since the beginning of the Schauraum. And we see each other on the 14th of September at 6 with Andreas Courvoisier on a Stadtspaziergang, Andreas Courvoisier von Courvoisier Stadtentwicklung, selbstverwaltete Wohnmodelle. Wir treffen uns um 18 Uhr vor dem Musikerwohnhaus in der Stiftung Habitat an der Lothringer Straße und gehen verschiedene Projekte anschauen, wo eben andere ökonomische Basen haben als normale Häuser, die einem Einzelperson oder so oder einer Pensionskasse gehören. Würde mich freuen, wenn ihr da kommen würdet, und wird sicher auch sehr spannend. Wir werden ins Westfeld, Felix-Platter-Spital gehen können, auch reingehen können als eine der vielleicht ersten. Es wird dann gerade so halbfertig sein. Besten Dank Thank you, Carol, to New York, and have a good day. And I hope we have a good evening, and let's talk some together outside with a glass of wine. Bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Dankeschön.